はい、それでは、第2部の方を始めさせていただきます。第1部の最初でも申し上げましたが、この会はZoom の方でも同時配信されております。で、Zoom の方では一応、62名の方に登録いただいております。何か、接続など、具合が悪いことが生じましたら、事前にご了承いただけたらと思います。それでは、第2部のレクチャーを始めたいと思いますが、モリソン先生のご紹介を最初にさせていただきたいと思います。モリソン先生はこれまで、プロコフィエフに関する論文集を編纂されているほか、プロコフィエフのソ連時代について、また妻のリーナについて本を出されています。どちらもアーカイブの資料に基づき、それまでに知られていなかった情報を世に知らしめた、とても素晴らしいご研究です。また、あちらでのレクチャーに加え、あちこちでのレクチャーに加え、プロコフィエフのバレエやオペラの、復興上演ですとか、初演にも積極的に取り組まれて、大変お忙しくされております。プロコフィエフ研究は、ここ10年ほどの間にとても発展していると言えます。最近では2020年に出たRethinking Prokofiev っていう論文集ですとか、あとオペラやバレエについての短著も出され、いろいろな人たちとの往復書簡の研究も進んでいます。その中で見れば、彼の日本時代についてはもう少し研究の余地がありそうにも思われます。なお、日本では出版されているプロコフィエフの本格的な伝記っていうのは、1968年に出版されたもので、翻訳書についても、新しいものだと1995年に出されたものだけなので、少し残念な状況と言えるかもしれません。この度、モリソン先生が、プロコフィエフの日本時代に注目してくださったことで、今後新たな道がいろいろと開かれるのではないかなと期待しております。これからレクチャーをお聞きしていただきますが、最初にちょっと一言だけ、ご説明しておきたいんですけれども、ビッグバットっていう言葉なんですが、あえてビッグバットってカタカナで、訳したのは、これがアメリカの花月っていうアニメのキャラクターということで、一応ビッグバットって訳したんですけれども、意味的には、とてもひどい状況ですとか、大惨事とか、そういった意味になります。それだけお伝えして、ではお願いしたいと思います。森荘先生、お願いします。
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank Shiori Kikuma for all of the heroic efforts to organize this presentation this afternoon. Thank you very much.
こんにちは。皆さん、こんにちは。そして、しおりさんに感謝の気持ち、この会を開催するにあたっていろいろとオーガナイズしてくれたことに感謝申し上げます。
I also want to thank my dear and very respected Japanese musicologist colleagues, Yumiko Nunokawa and Shinichi Numabe, for their wonderful contributions to Prokofiev scholarship over the past years. Their work is an inspiration for me.
この会にあたって日本の音楽学者である馬出真一さん、Could you please? 沼部真一さんと、すみません、私はよく知る布川由美子さんに感謝申し上げます。
And lastly, of course, I want to thank Yoshio Hamano for the wonderful performance before this, the beautiful rendition of the 10th Piano Sonata Fragment, and all of those very, very complicated compositions, which are easy to sound unmusical, but he turned them into to poetry, and I was really, it was a blessing to hear this music.
最後に、浜野義雄さん、今日ピアノを弾いてくれた浜野義雄さんに、演奏してくれたことを感謝申し上げます。そして、プログラムの内容がソナタ10番断片的なものを弾いてくれたり、また、簡単に聞こえると思うんですけど、もっと、そういうふうに簡単に聞こえるようで難しい曲を ポエティックに弾いてくれたことにとても感謝しております。
Okay, and thank you everybody for coming today. So I'm going to speak about Prokofiev in Japan. And this is a strange story about music and a restaurant and Tanka poems and what I'm going to call the big bad. One of the things that Russians like to do is to boast of their great contributions to world culture. These contributions are touted during times of crises, including the current one. Russia's catastrophic invasion of Ukraine is a crime so monstrous as to threaten the existence of Ukraine and Russia. And if Russia loses in too obvious a fashion, Russia might tear itself apart. This is a frightening time. The big bad. Russia has engineered other frightening times, including the apocalypse of the Russian Revolution, which the defenders of Russian culture never tire of arguing, ushered in a flourishing in the arts, like the futurist movement that Prokofiev rejected. Art flourishes under terrible conditions, and art, because it is supposedly transcendent, survives terrible conditions. Those who hate Russia's politics and love Russia's culture have always taken comfort in the fact that Russian artists more often than not resisted their governments than served them. And this is not quite true. Russian art, even the subversive stuff, has usually been state-sponsored. The Ballet Russe performed in Paris with funding from Duchess Yelena Pavlovna of the Imperial Court in St. Petersburg, for example. The first Russian conservatories were established in St. Petersburg and Moscow in the 1860s by two brothers who had studied music in Germany. One of them was Anton Rubinstein, and the second was Nikolai Rubinstein. Tchaikovsky, as we know, was the first famous graduate of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and he taught for 12 years at the Moscow Conservatory. He wrote a harmony textbook for his students using translations of French and German texts. Some of his students became successful musicians, Sergei Tenayev, for example, and the violinist Yosef Kotek. Another one of his students, arguably the most important of all, is this person. He ended up teaching German and Russian philosophy at Tokyo Imperial University while also composing and facilitating the performance of the first opera in Japan, which was Gluck's Orpheus. I refer here to Raphael von Kober, an eminent sensei of the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Under Tchaikovsky's tutelage, von Kober composed a Concertstück for piano and orchestra in B minor, a composition cast in a heroic mold with an exceptionally difficult piano part. Von Kober left Russia to study philosophy in Germany, and that is where the Japanese minister Shuso Aoki, hired him to teach in Tokyo in the year of Tchaikovsky's death, which is 1893. Von Kober took up a position in the humanities department of Tokyo Imperial University, where he lectured on Plato and Socrates and organized courses in ancient Greek. Meantime, at the Tokyo School of Foreign Languages, he taught Russian, which was very important in the context of the Russo-Japanese War. Lastly, the very busy, very versatile von Kober gave recitals and taught music at the College of Music in Ueno. His famous harshness as a music teacher is captured in a novel written by Takeo Arishima called Woman. The novel describes a student being rejected by von Kober from admission to the music school. You have ability, but you have no talent. The student threw a violin out of the window and left the music school forever. One of his real, not fictional students, Natsume Soseki, wrote an essay about him called Keberu Sensei. Soseki asked Kober if he ever wanted to return to Russia or Europe. Japan is more beautiful, he answered. But then he said, if there is something missing in Japan, it is concerts. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because von Kober helped to begin the process that brought waves of Russian and European performers to Japan in politically perilous times. Von Kober brought Tchaikovsky and the Tchaikovsky tradition here, and the Tchaikovsky tradition has thrived here even as it has declined elsewhere. I am also telling you this because the 1860s was a time of nationalist uprisings around the world. Musical nationalism dates from the 1860s. Tchaikovsky resisted it. His music was cosmopolitan and international. It was influenced by French, German, Italian, and occasional Russian idioms. Prokofiev too resisted this. He relied as much as possible on his imagination when he composed. He did not use folk music in his music until much later in his life, when the Soviet government forced him to. Before the 1860s, no one much cared about whether this piece of music came from that place or the source of this or that tune, or the differences between French and German and Russian and Japanese music, past and present, north and south, east and west. For complicated reasons, musicologists started to care hugely about these things, and they still do, even though music is supposedly an art that has no home, that belongs everywhere and to everyone. Tchaikovsky and Prokofiev thought about music along these lines in their itinerant lives. Both composers traveled constantly. They had no home. Their music had no home. Their music came from everywhere. It belonged to everywhere. Lastly, I am telling you this because in music, the claims of Russia's musical superiority are based on flimsy pretexts. Japan has a deeper and richer musical history than Russia because it is an older civilization. And in terms of the adopting of European classical musical traditions, Russia and Japan are quite close to one another. What Prokofiev borrowed from the French and German traditions are precisely what Kosaku, Yamada took from them. And both composers faced the problem of expelling these influences in favor of a non-1860s, non-national idiom of their own. For Prokofiev, the beginning of that expulsion took place here. In Japan, as I will attempt to explain in this talk, Prokofiev started to embrace the idiom of new simplicity, the white key diatonicism that defined his music in the 1920s. Even his noisier compositions, like Le Pâtissier and The Fiery Angel, Ogneni Angel, include passages of pureness. The music is desemanticized, deracinated. The music occupies a space of what he would call and what he would compose in, called things in themselves. And I will come back to this idea. When Prokofiev came here, he had his musical talent, a suitcase, and nothing else. He was escaping the 1917 Big Bad, the revolution and the civil war consuming Russia from west to east. He had no clue what was happening. No one else did. He needed to clear his mind. He needed to clear out his music. He needed ideas. And Japan served him well in this regard. Shiori.
Thank you. すみません。ここでちょっと解説と補足を入れさせていただきます。ここまでのモリソン先生のレクチャーの導入部分では、プロコフィエフがロシアのビッグバットから逃げて日本に来たんですけれども、その当の日本はどのような状況だったかというと、1860年代のナショナリズムのもと、親と外国人教師たちを呼んで、その結果、フランスやドイツの影響が強かった。ただし、ロシアから来たケーベル、ロシア出身のケーベルは、チャイコフスキーの伝統を受け継いでコスモポリタンであったけれども、とにかく山田耕作もプロコフィエフもドイツ、フランスの影響の中で自分の語法を探さなければならなかった。ということで、モリソン先生によれば、そのドイツ、フランスの影響を、自分の中から追い出すプロセスが日本で始まったというふうに先生がおっしゃっていて、これが先生独自の斬新な視点であると思います。なぜかというと、あんまりプロコフィエフの音楽語法の変化地点として1918年が注目されるこ ことがないからです。一般に、プロコフィエフの音楽語法がどのように変化したかと言われているというと、ちょっと私の方の補足資料をご覧いただきたいんですけれども、大まかに言いますと、プロコフィエフの、音楽語法は、まず1910年代の音楽院時代、ロシアで過ごした音楽院時代に不協和音や半音階を多用していた時期、それから1920年代半ば、あるいは1930年代前半から始まったニューシンプリシティと呼ばれている全音階を多用した時期、そしてソ連時代の語法というふうに少しずつ変化します。モリソン先生によれば、ニューシンプリシティの傾向とは、民族的な貴族性のぼやかされた、現象から切り離された精神的なもの自体、音自体の空間への思考であって、そうした音楽に向かい始めたのが1918年かもしれないということを、おっしゃっています。これについてまだもうちょっと続きます。すみません。これについて私が気づくことを申し上げますと、プロコフィエフは全音階や古典への好みを若い頃から持っていて、ピアノの発見だけからなる音楽を着想したのもロシア時代ではあるのですが、その発見のメロディにしてもロシア時代と日本滞在後では少し性質が違っているかもしれないということです。例えば、1914年に書かれたバレエ音楽アラとロリーをもとに編曲されたスキタイ組曲っていう曲があるんですが、その第3曲の夜という曲でも、冒頭に発見のメロディーが使われています。ちょっとここで一つ弾いてみますと、夜っていう曲の冒頭なんですけど、これはあからさまに東洋趣味的なメロディーだと思います。これについてプロコフィエフ自身が言ってることがあるんですけど、1916年にスキタイ組曲を初演するときにリハーサルがあって、そのリハーサルの時に楽団員からなんでこんなに不快な不協和音が多いのかって聞かれた時に、プロコフィエフはいろいろ説明する中でこれ日記の中に書いてあるんですけれども、歴史や教科書や日本の音楽を引き合いに出して説明したというふうに、日記では書かれています。というわけで日本音楽は初めからちょっと東洋趣味的な感じで意識されていた可能性はあります。また同じくこちらも1914年の秋に着想された白い四重奏曲っていうものがあるんですけれども、その第一楽章第一世代は、プロコフィエフの日記によれば7度に基づいて書かれている、7度の構成で書かれている、日記に書かれています。で、この主題というのは、後に炎の天使の修道院の場面に使われることになる主題です。これもちょっと弾いてみたいと思います。炎の天使なんですけど。これが八王子でこういう感じで始まって、で次にA波単調に転調するんですけど、それがさらに7度の和音ということが分かりやすくて、この和音に基づいてこういうふうにこれが7度に基づく発見の四重奏曲の主題なんですけど、私のまだ仮説なんですけど、仮説によればこの曲このメロディーはストラヴィンスキーの中国を舞台にする夜泣きウグイスに影響を受けている それ、プロコフィエフが1914年の夏にロンドンで見たんですけど、とにかく、そういうわけで、割とこの東洋趣味的な刺激を背景として、この頃の発見のメロディーは書かれていたように思われます。それが日本滞在後に書かれる発見のメロディーは、より民族的な貴族性の薄い方向に変わっていくのではないかなっていうことがモリソン先生のレクチャーから想像されるのですが、この先のレクチャーをお聞きしてみたいと思います。
Okay. The tale of Prokofiev's time in Japan is familiar. It has been told by Yumiko Nonakawa and Shinichi Numabe in English, Norio Umetsu in Japanese, and Manashir Yakubov in Russian, among other places. The tale comes chiefly from Prokofiev's diaries, which the composer carefully curated in a happy-go-lucky sprezzatura style, leaving out details about whom he met and what music he heard, making all sorts of mistakes with respect to the prices of things and fibbing about how his concerts in Japan were organized. Prokofiev meant for his diaries to be read, and he carefully curated an unflappable, unemotional view of himself that suggested no anxiety, no fear, no dread, no loneliness. War and revolution were the heavy no dramas that he doesn't much talk about. His diary is more in keeping with kyogen, comic vignettes. He came to Japan in search of a future that he knew Russia could not offer him. The February and October revolutions and the economic calamity that followed had brought musical life to a halt. There were few concerts and there was no money to commission operas or ballets or symphonies. The tale is that Prokofiev neither fled nor escaped. He had no interest in burning bridges. He planned to return home once the chaos had ended. The second part is true, but not the first part. Prokofiev needed to get out of Russia because he was subject to mobilization. Recruitment in the army, or two armies, the Imperial Army and then the Red Army. He was literally caught between the two phases of the Russian Revolution. He had first received special permission in writing to leave from the head of the provisional government, Alexander Kerensky, but then the Bolsheviks came to power. On April 20th, 1918, Prokofiev again requested permission to leave, now from the People's Commissar of the Enlightenment, Anatoly Lunacharsky. According to documents, including letters housed in the Russian State Archive of Social Political History, the second request was granted on the promise that Prokofiev would serve as a cultural diplomat abroad, the embodiment of the hopes of the revolution and the sound of the future. He would not return to Russia for 9 years, spending most of that time in Europe. On May 7th, 1918, Prokofiev left Moscow by Siberian Express, traveling in a first-class compartment. It was the last train that made the trip without trouble, but even this trip was longer than planned. Instead of 10 days, it took 16 days since the train had to reroute to avoid fighting. His baggage was searched repeatedly. Then he was stuck for 5 days in Vladivostok, waiting for a Japanese visa and watching his rubles lose their value. He was so poor that he went to the racetrack to bet on horses, which made him poorer. Prokofiev had to ask for financial help from a newspaper editor, a friend of a friend of a friend, to buy his ticket to Japan. He sailed for 2 days on the Hozan Maru steamer to Japan with masses of fleeing Russians who, upon arrival, rudely accused their Japanese hosts of, quote, ambitions to annex Eastern Siberia, unquote. Siberia, Prokofiev joked, should only be so lucky. And that was about as political as he got, telling jokes. Somehow he thought that he could stay one step ahead of the big bad, and indeed he did until the 1930s. Japan, he seems to have known, had been asked by the French to intervene in Russia after 1917, but declined until the government recognized that the collapse of the Romanov dynasty meant that Siberia was up for grabs. In July of 1918, in the middle of Prokofiev's time here, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, asked the Japanese government to provide 7,000 soldiers as part of an international coalition to establish a buffer state in Siberia. That state would protect Japan from future Russian aggression. The anti-Bolshevik Allied reasoning went. Just a few days after Prokofiev left Japan, on August 8, 1918, Japan dispatched 18,000 soldiers to Vladivostok. Prokofiev imagined going straight from Japan to South America en route to the United States, but he instead stayed for 2 months to experience the prosperous Taisho era. The United States was not routing steamers to Japan owing to anti-Asian immigration policies, so Prokofiev ended up taking a Dutch steamer to America instead. He also had to wait for an American visa, and he spent a lot of his time running around dealing with bureaucracy. He distracted himself by buying a pair of yellow shoes, studying Spanish, and reading Schopenhauer. Von Kuba would have improved. He traveled around with other Russian musicians in Japan, including some of his own St. Petersburg Conservatory classmates. Prokofiev tells his diary that he liked the stereotypical Japanese things he saw, geishas included. And he started writing a confessional story called Guilty Pleasure, one of his unsuccessful forays into creative writing. Japan seemed miraculously orderly and tranquil compared to what he had left behind. It was bleak back there. People were stumbling around in the dark, shell-shocked and traumatized, and he was happy to be in the light, on the light side. Prokofiev met with the Marquis Yorisada Tokugawa, who, as you know, was both a politician and a businessman and a scholar of music. Tokugawa knew von Kuba. He also came to know Prokofiev, who knew nothing of Japanese history beyond what his Japan-obsessed friend, the symbolist poet Constantine Belmonte, told him. Prokofiev instead recognized in Tokugawa the equivalent of a Russian boyar, a hereditary landowner. He agreed to write a piano piece for him for a princely sum of 500 yen. One of the sources I consulted for this lecture points out that the average income of a civil servant in Japan at this time was 583 yen. Tickets for Prokofiev's recitals in Japan were 3 to 5 yen, which was not cheap. A lot of tickets had to be given away for free. Prokofiev also met Muto Atoguro, the privileged son of an electronics entrepreneur who had just written the second volume of a history of European music that described Prokofiev in much the same terms as Montagu Nathan did in his 1917 book, Contemporary Russian Composers, a book which extols Prokofiev's originality and genius and summarizes Prokofiev's manner as puckishness. Atoguro referenced Montagu Nathan's book in his own book on Russian music, but he had earlier in 1917 published an article about Prokofiev called New Star of Russian Music. Atoguro trained privately in music before being sent by his father to London in 1913 to study at the London School of Economics. There, Atoguro attended as many concerts as he could, including several of the London performances of the Ballet Russe. And he purchased a trove of scores. He first heard Prokofiev in 1915. A colleague of Atogoro's in the United States, Keizo Hariuchi, affirmed Prokofiev's growing international recognition. Prokofiev gave recitals at the Imperial Theater in Tokyo on July 6 and 7, 1918, and then another recital at the Grand Hotel in Yokohama. This was the place that other Russian musicians who had left Russia performed, thanks to the efforts of a Jewish Latvian impresario named Afsai Strok, who lived in Shanghai but opened an office in Tokyo. 1918 marked the beginning of a 22-year stretch when Strok brought famous Russian, American, French, and German musicians to Shanghai, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Osaka, and other East Asian cities. Fyodor Shalyapin was one of his clients, so too Arthur Rubinstein and Ephraim Zimbalist. Strok brought the music of colonizing powers, often for the entertainment of expats, and his personal taste in music was on the fluffier, lighter side. Strok's younger brother composed foxtrots and tangos by the dozens. Strok lived from 1876 to 1956. He died here in Tokyo. He tried to convince Prokofiev to tour China, but Prokofiev declined. And so what would have been the dubious pleasure of performing his piano music at the Shanghai YWCA, the Shanghai American Women's Club, and the Grand Hotel to Peking was avoided. There is Strok. Strok organized Prokofiev's concerts on a profit-sharing basis, though Prokofiev complained in his diary that Strok was fleecing him. He also claimed that he met Strok in Yokohama by chance, and that the concerts were hastily organized for him to help him to pay his hotel bills. So in that respect, he was very lucky to have met Strok. There was a pre-concert reception for Prokofiev in a very traditional Japanese restaurant called Kagetsu. There, Prokofiev dined with Atoguro and learned that Atoguro was running a music publishing business called Music and Literature Company out of his home in Omori. His father had financed a music journal with that same name, Music and Literature, which focused on the music of symbolist and modernist composers and advertised Prokofiev's performances in Japan in the July 1918 issue. Prokofiev self-centeredly reported in his diary that Otogoro's history of music contains several references to me, and that Otogoro is extremely well informed about Russian music, and we spent the whole dinner served Japanese style with us sitting on our haunches talking in English. And he describes the recitals as follows. July 6th, I wasn't feeling too bad in the morning and set off for the concert, although a little warily. I played in a rather detached way, looking on as if it were business. The audience was small. It was a Saturday at 1:15 p.m. and it was hot. So it was a good thing that we had sold the concert. The audience, almost entirely Japanese, listened attentively. They did not applaud much, and practically only for reasons that were technically demanding. They were not disconcerted by dissonances because the Japanese are accustomed to a totally different type of music, and they therefore feel hardly any difference between consonance and dissonance. This is racism. Second concert, the audience was larger because the director had distributed 100 complimentary tickets, and so the hall looked respectable. Again, the audience listened politely. At the request of some local Japanese musicians, I suggested Suggestion Diabolique on the program, as it appeared to be their favorite piece. Once more, the most technically demanding pieces were best received. July 9th, the audience was tiny, 40 to 50 people, but listened with great seriousness. Otogoro attended the performances and offered praise for everything he heard, pointing out resonances with Scriabin and writing up an analysis of Prokofiev's second piano sonata. Prokofiev and Otogoro met a few more times before Prokofiev left Japan on August 2, 1918. Otogoro reports Prokofiev's eccentricities, wearing a kimono awkwardly, for example, and played cards and drank beer with him and discussed music at length with him. Prokofiev went into detail about his opera, The Gambler, which had yet to be performed, and offered his thoughts on Scriabin and Stravinsky and Metner and Miaskovsky and Russian music critics. He promised to write a short article for Otogoro's journal about Miaskovsky's music, and he did. It was published in Japanese translation of Prokofiev's French original in the August 1918 issue. Before playing, As part of lightly attended recitals, Prokofiev performed his Opus 11 Toccata, which Prokofiev claimed that Robert Schumann's Toccata had inspired, but the two works have nothing in common besides repeated 16th notes. A more immediate influence on its composition was a pianist to whom the score was dedicated, Nikolai Stember. He and Prokofiev were classmates at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, competing for attention in Anna Yesipova's piano studio. Their friendship extended through the Russian Revolution, after which Prokofiev headed east through Japan to the United States, and Stember fled to Serbia with his sisters. Quote, Stember is a young man of about 20, Prokofiev wrote in his diary in 1910. Not very good looking and very serious. He is modest but extremely resilient, generally a nice fellow, although not without a few rough edges to his character. Outside of class, they fraternized at the Sokol gymnastics club, with which Stember was incredibly taken and played an important part in Prokofiev's life. The club hosted monthly musical get-togethers, for which Prokofiev wrote his recently discovered Sokol March, the iconoclastic caprice in musical athleticism that eventually earned him the nickname Enfant Terrible, stems from this period in his output. The toccata, composed to challenge Stember's technique and his own, became the most popular example. Before playing it in Japan, Prokofiev played it in recital for students and professors of the Kiev Conservatory on November 17, 1916. He performed it again the next night in Kiev as one of 3 encores for an Imperial Russian Musical Society concert featuring his first piano concerto and pieces by other Russian composers. Reviews were mixed, though Prokofiev's friend Nikolai Miaskovsky called the toccata, quote, a fiendishly clever thing, edgy, energetic, and full of personality. The themes are the height of simplicity and physical expression. It might well seem strange that I'm writing an entire dithyramb about a piece of 10 to 12 pages, but I can't help but scream in delight, unquote. Miaskovsky echoed this sentiment in print, describing the work as, quote, colossally difficult, a technical challenge that you have to think only a pianist with tremendous technique and stamina could handle. One such pianist is Yoshio Hamano. And again, I am grateful for you for performing several of Prokofiev's pieces before this lecture. There exists a recording of Prokofiev playing this piece, the Toccata. It's not very good. Not very good. He was sick. In Japan, Prokofiev also performed his Vision Fugitive. According to his personal manuscript catalog, the title owes to the symbolist poet Balmont, who fueled his interest in Slavic primitivism, legends of the peoples of the Eurasian steppe and the Pontic Scythians. Prokofiev found the epigraph and the Russian title of this set. Vision Fugitive in Russian is Mimolotnosti. In Balmont's 1903 pantheistic collection, Let Us Be Like the Sun, a book of symbols, Budem kak sulce, kniga symbolov. In every fleeting vision, I see worlds filled with the fickle play of rainbows. Prokofiev sketched, or as he preferred, squibbed, numbers 5, 6, 10, 16, and 17 while vacation in 1915 in Terioki. He mentally dedicated each one of these pieces to a girl that he liked. The chimes in the briefest piece, number 5, Con Eleganza, represented the marriage of Lydia Korneyeva to a captain in the Russian Navy. The score has no overarching program, though images of the transience of youth, the turbulent final years of the Romanov dynasty, and the demons awaiting release by the Bolsheviks have been mapped onto them. The impressionistic number 7 began life as a work for harp, specifically written for the harpist Eleonora Damskaya, on whom he had a crush before becoming a piano piece. And we heard this piece in the beautiful recital before this performance. Prokofiev notes that the 19th piece, a brief presto agitatissimo e molto accentuato, was inspired by the events of February 1917 in Petrograd, the first phase of the Big Bad. And we heard this as well. The publisher Gutal in Moscow, an imprint of Kusevitsky's firm, printed the first edition of the Vision Fugitive in 1917. In May of that year, the ban on exporting music scores from Russia to Japan was lifted. Prokofiev brought some of those scores with him to Japan as a sign of cultural rapprochement, but that rapprochement was short-lived. Prokofiev packed several copies of Vision Fugitive in his trunk. Otoguro was grateful to receive him, and he raved about Prokofiev's performance of the set. Now to the theory. The idea that the theme of the final movement of Prokofiev's third piano concerto references a Japanese folk song, Ichigo-jishi. The concerto took several years to compose. Sketch material dates from 1913, and it wasn't completed until 1921. The theory about Ichigo-jishi comes from the music critic Koichi Nomura, who claimed to have met Prokofiev and, in his 1953 book about piano music, declared without evidence that the composer heard the folk song and stuck it into the concerto. Since no sketch exists to support the claim, we are left with our ears, and this documentary, to which I am grateful to Shiori Kikuma for bringing to my attention and obtaining for this talk.
すいません。そしたらここでNHK のラララクラシックでピアノコンチェルト3番と越後地震の関係について、番組が放送されて、2020年の、3月に放送された番組がありますので、8分ほどお聞きいただきたいと思います。少々お待ちください。日本でこのような噂があるという証拠の一つとしてここで流しました。それではレクチャーの続きをお願いします。
That was wonderful. And let me also read from this wonderfully entertaining blog post by Kantaro Azuma about possible Japanese resonances in the third piano concerto. The rustic atmosphere at the beginning of the second movement is strangely intertwined with semitones and pretends to be Western, but I feel the East there. This is the bam-ba-dam. This line here. The way this is played 5 times is just like the Kabuki 7 changes. And the eeriness of the 4th variation is just like the specter of the no play called Shugigomo, which I saw the other day. No, it's okay. It's just quick. In the third movement, this simple piano theme, which is inserted before the Rachmaninoff-like second theme, also uses a chromatic scale and is deformed in a Western style, but I find the elegant simplicity of the Japanese rock garden at the bottom of the music. Bum, 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 riam, bum, 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 etc., etc. Above all, I tried to give some examples that I can think of, but in my opinion, this concerto has the color of a Japanese rhapsody, which he was trying to include in his unfinished white key quartet. However, Prokofiev tried to avoid having the Japanese color appearing vividly on the surface of the concerto because he had a good sense of music and he was intelligent. Instead, he pretended it was a Western sonata using the romanticism of Chopin and Rachmaninoff and the neoclassicism which Prokofiev is trying to establish. It is very similar to Bartók's adaptation of Hungarian folk songs into classical music, but there is a significant difference between Bartók and Prokofiev. Prokofiev did not seem to have had any affection for Japanese folk songs and music. Rather, they were in his memory and he used them as his musical materials. Last quotation. In any case, why couldn't a modern Japanese composer write such a piece? We have such a wonderful example here. That is because I feel that the classical musical world is dominated by an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West, which is similar to the attitude of the Japanese who have no pride in saying that the reference to Ichikojishi is a myth because Japanese folk songs and music are ignored in the West. There are some Japanese composers who use Japanese folk songs to compose their music, but then they end up being overly immersed in folklore. There is little expectation that the music will be played at the concert where people come to listen to Mozart and Brahms. Again, this is a wonderfully entertaining discussion, though personally I think that the similarities, as Oma speaks about, fall into the realm of coincidences. But I still think that the third piano concerto was influenced by Japan. In fact, I think that Japan had a huge conceptual influence on Prokofiev, which we can begin to understand when we realize that the concerto was dedicated to his aforementioned symbolist friend Balmont, who came to Japan in 1916 on the same ship that Prokofiev did, the Hozan Maru. Balmont's Japan obsession increased rather than decreased during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which was a disaster for Russia and which Russians view reductively as the event that triggered the revolution of 1905, then the subsequent revolutions of 1917 and the collapse of the Tsarist Empire. Tsar Nikolai II considered Japan, quote, feminine, weak, and inferior, unquote. And he used no shortage of racist invective leading up to his failed war. His fantasies of conquering the land of moonflowers and Zen Langor crashed into the extremely harsh reality of actual people willing to actually fight. The Russo-Japanese War was for Russia the end of colonialist Orientalism and the end of Russia as Balmont and Prokofiev knew it. Russia clings to its cultural superiority in the face of its inferiority in other matters. But for Balmont, Japan was the superior culture. He fully identified with Japan and tried to transform himself into a Japanese poet, writing the Russian equivalent of Tanka, replicating the form of 5 lines with a 5-7 syllable pattern. He experimented with vertical poetry and he embraced common epithets for Japan. Asnova Solnsa, pillar of the sun, Koren Sveta, root of the light. Verticalness in European poetry is habitually associated with the sacred, transcendence, and consciousness. Balmont claimed a Japanese literary inspiration in his conception of the vertical as something much different. The vertical manifests the intense aspects of life, whereas the horizontal is life's blander unfolding. A famous Russian novel called Oblomov confines the title character to the horizontal. He lives a boring, eventless existence, staying in bed most of the time, never leaving his apartment. To lose the intensity is to live like Oblomov, a life that is boringly, exclusively horizontal. Balmont wanted to maintain the intensity, as did Prokofiev. Japan is small compared to Russia, but Balmont recognized the limitlessness of the poetry that he studied. Tiny poems participate in broad meditations. Balmont translated a tanka by Abenos Nakamaro from the 8th century into Russian. Nakamaro, who left Japan for China never to return, is famous for this poem. It's melancholic, a longing for home. And what Balmont did was to remove the Japanese content of the poem to make it cosmic and universal. So the original poem reads, "When I look up into the vast sky tonight, it is the same moon that I saw rising from behind Mount Kasuga Shrine all those years ago. Balmont, look at the hugeness of the distant moon in the spaciousness of the heaven. Is it not the same moon of childhood?" Again, what Balmont did was to remove the Japanese content of the poem to make it cosmic and universal. And Prokofiev did the same thing in his music, desemanticizing and deracinating Ichigo Jishi and everything else he heard in Japan to conceive his neoclassical aesthetic. I could be irresponsible and say that Prokofiev's mutable approach to tonality can be likened to an aspect of Japanese folk music identified by Fumio Koizumi, the idea of nuclear tones competing at tonal centers. I could be even more irresponsible and say that traditional Russian music relies, like traditional Japanese music, on tetrachords in perfect fourths and the occasional pentatonic minor, but doing so would be irresponsibly reductive. Japan allowed Prokofiev to clear his mind, and that mind clearing meant returning to traditional harmonies, the diatonic system, and composing white key music. The cleared mind, if you'll forgive the Cartesian reference, is thought itself. And this music was his first exercise in composing what he called things in themselves. In Prokofiev's shorter autobiography, as Azuma references in his blog post, Prokofiev discussed this precise moment in his career when he became interested in writing purely diatonic white themes. While in the early stages of composing the third piano concerto, Prokofiev, quote, contemplated writing a white quartet, that is, an absolutely diatonic string quartet that would be played only on the white keys of the piano, unquote. The projected two-movement work remained unrealized because, quote, I found the task too difficult. I decided to split up the material. The subordinate theme became the theme of Renata and the Fiery Angel. The principal theme I used for the monastery. The first and second themes of the finale went into the finale of the third concerto. Thus, when I began working on the latter, I already had the entire thematic material with the exception of the subordinate theme of the first movement and the third theme of the finale.
はい、それでは、ここでまた少し解説を入れさせていただきます。残念ながらスケッチブックにはプロコフィエフのスケッチブックにはコンチェルト3番と3番と越後地震の関係を裏付けるようなはっきりとした何かは見つけられなかったということで、それでポイントになってくるのがやっぱりこの白い四重奏曲というものなんですけれども、この四重奏曲についてまた菊間作成の配布資料の方に少しまとめましたのでご覧ください。この白い四重奏曲の第一楽章の方は先ほどちょっと触れましたように1914年の秋に着想されていて、第一主題が7度の構成で書かれています。でちなみに第二主題は、炎の天使のレナータの主題になったと思われています。一方、第二楽章の方は協奏曲第3番の最終楽章の第1および第2主題に使われることになるんですけれども、先ほどビデオでもお聞きになっていただいたように、それらのメロディーはその7度の構成の炎の天使に使われたメロディーとはだいぶ異なる性質を持っています。プロコフィエフは奈良で白い四重奏曲のことを4年ぶりに思い出して再構想してでアメリカに向かう船の中で、第二楽章を作曲しているんですけれども、そういうことを考えると日本的な要素が含まれているという根拠は十分にあると言えると思います。ただですね、ピアノコンチェルトの3番の第3楽章の 一番最後のところはラベルのスペイン教詞曲にすごく似ているので、そう考えると、冒頭主題もまたタンタタタンっていうようなリズムが最終的にスペイン的なものになんか融合していくような感じもあって、国籍をなんとなくぼやかした独自のミックススタイルが作られていったのかなということが考えられます。それでこれからモリソン先生が協奏曲3番の最終楽章の第3主題の方について、お話しくださいますけれども、こちらの主題はプロコフィエフが1921年の夏にフランスの海辺の町ロシュレでバリモントと、近所に住んでいた時に書かれたもので、これもまた発見の主題を根底に置いたものとなっているようです。で先生のお話と合わせて考えますと、発見のメロディーが、オリエンタリズムから離れて彼自身の語法の中に取り込まれていくプロセスが時系列でたどれるような気がします。ちなみになんですけれども、ソ連の音楽学者のビクトル・デリソンという人が、協奏曲第3番の第1楽章の冒頭主題は、特にロシア的で古い民族的な戦法を使っていると書いています。これが第1楽章の方の主題についてで、実際その第1楽章はロシアでスケッチが完成しているので、それは全然不思議ではないことだと思います。しかしデリソンは第3楽章の第1主題についてもやはり戦法的でもあり、ロシアの民族的な節回しでもあり、もしスローモーションでレガートで歌ってみれば純粋にロシア的な性質が感じられると書いています。これもまたモリソン先生が、この先かな、レクチャーの中で述べられるナショナリズムの要素っていうのは意図せずして世界共通のものに、世界共通の語法になりうるっていう、問題の一例ではないかなと思います。それではお願いします。
Two white key themes, and then okay. Okay, let us dwell on a passage from the third piano concerto, one of the themes. This is the Meno Mosso C section of the third movement of the concerto and the intensified chromatic displacement of the white theme. Whereas the A and B sections of the movement, a rondo form, move from A minor to C major, this section moves from an implied C sharp major to implied E major, what Conrad Harley, in a dissertation that seeks to impose order on Prokofiev's harmonic language, calls the relative major of the parallel minor. Most fascinating about this passage and most frustrating to Harley is the amorphous texture, the manner in which the music hovers between tonal realms with ever settling in either of them. The C sharp major chord is never heard in root position, and the E major tonic is never, ever heard. The C sharp major triad is extended in inversion through a kind of voice exchange that prepares kind of for the modulation to E major, which is the desired object, melancholically longed for to borrow Balmont's via Nakamura's language. In measure 149, the harmonic movement suggests a cadential 6/4 in E major. One might expect an E major resolution, but we don't get it. We get C sharp major again in inversion. Okay. Okay. And so forth. One of the habits of music theory is to explain how the music should have gone, how it might have landed in E major had Prokofiev chosen a 5/7 progression to 1 in E major, as opposed to moving from his favorite form of the dominant 5/7 sharp 5 to 1 in C sharp major. And Conrad Harley recomposes the passage as follows. This is how it would conclude in E major. Harley provides us with the horizontal aspect of the sound at the expense of the vertical. Prokofiev is all about the vertical, the intense expansion of the sound through all sorts of harmonic directions, from C major through its C sharp major shadow and the modulation of that shadow into the relative major of the parallel minor, all at once. The music is not goal directed. The goal isn't achieved. We're instead in the realm of the Tanka, the intense, compact, poetic utterance, as opposed to the blander unfolding. Prokofiev left Japan with the white key music. He premiered his Balmont-dedicated concerto as soloist on December 16, 1921 in Chicago. He left never to return, but his contact with Japan did not end, as an article in the World magazine from October 17, 1918 relates. Titled East, West and Music, the article describes a soiree at the massive apartment of dancer Adolf Bohm on East 59th Street in New York City. The apartment served as home, studio, and salon, as well as what another magazine called an artistic league of nations. Prokofiev is described as having the, quote, the dull earnestness of a precocious child, unquote, and a, quote, cordial, honest manner, if a trifle shy and over-modest, unquote. Standing beside him, quote, was a young Japanese man of middle height, Kosaku Yamada, the brilliant Japanese composer and conductor of the Tokyo Symphony Orchestra. We were enjoying an after-dinner course of art, exoticism, and good spirits. There were curious lights with music alternating with talk and talk with laughter. There were the inevitable topics, the world in a monumental uproar, claims that can no longer be trusted, nations changing like smoke with enough powder burning in France to blow the Atlantic Ocean into the sky, Russia doing red revolutionary somersaults, and even staid old Japan with rice riots and other unseemly disturbances of the public tranquility. Then, after some vain persuasions, Prokofiev was carried bodily to the piano. As he fell onto the seat, he fell into the mood and he began to play, unquote. Yamada and Prokofiev knew each other very well and met both in the United States and the Soviet Union. Their careers have several points in common. Both of them crisscrossed the planet, buffeted by war and revolution. In 1912, Yamada completed his first opera, Achitaro Tenuyo, The Depraved Heavenly Maiden, his version of The Fiery Angel. In 1916, Yamada collaborated with the dancer Bakishi in a series of choreographic tone poems. In December of 1917, he came to the United States for the first time, and on October 16, 1918, he conducted a program of his music together, controversially, with Wagner's music at Carnegie Hall. Prokofiev heard a follow-up concert on January 24, 1919, which had this program. A symphony in a traditional format called Kachidoki to Heiwa, Triumph and Peace, the United States premiere. Japanese folk songs sung in English. A choreographic symphony called Maria Magdalena. And in the Wagner music, Die Walküre, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, the Act 1 prelude. What Prokofiev did not like was Yamada's appropriations of Strauss and Wagner, from whom Prokofiev also borrowed. He also didn't like the fact that Yamada felt obliged to compose music in a Japanese idiom, despite being entirely trained in the German tradition. His symphony was written for Max Bruch in Berlin, and it is scored like Mendelssohn, no trombones or tuba. The national aspect is a mild reference to the Japanese anthem based on gagaku, but frankly, this symphony could have been composed by a composer based in England or Germany or Denmark or Bohemia, and I hear a lot of Dvorak in it. That's the problem with musical nationalism. It becomes everything everywhere all at once. It becomes a product of the metaverse. Just a sample of that. Still, Yamada had to put on national garb for the Japan Society in New York and for the administrators of Carnegie Hall. So his habit as songwriter, according to Review and Vanity Fair, meant paraphrasing Japanese melodies using European developmental procedures. Quote, the harmony is rich and appropriate, and the whole effect is to bring out a charming and particularly unique vein of beauty, all that haunting miniature mood that we find in Japanese poetry, unquote. Yamada tucked the intonations of Japanese speech into songs whose forms and harmonic syntax recalled Schubert and Wolf. This is comparable to what Prokofiev did in his melodic mold technique, whereby a short phrase or melodic idea could be expanded and contracted to accommodate different Russian word combinations. In 1922, Yamada and his poet colleague Hakusho Kitahara started a journal called Verse and Music, concerned with finding a synthesis of Japanese verbal and musical language. It could well have been edited by Vladimir Stasov in the Russian context. So even the effort to be ultra-national has international resonance. Here in Tokyo in the mid-1920s, Yamada organized a festival of Russian and Japanese music that included 35 Russian musicians displaced by the revolution and living in Manchuria. Yamada appeared as a conductor and composer in the Soviet Union in 1933, the year that Prokofiev fulfilled his first commission for Lieutenant Kije. He and Prokofiev were born in different places, but came from the same musical homeland, that of Scriabin and Debussy. Some of Yamada's arrangements and some of the arrangements of Yamada's arrangements ended up sounding like Prokofiev, as illustrated here. One of the sources I read for the preparation of this talk claimed that Prokofiev dined in a Tokyo restaurant called Hanazuki rather than Kagetsu. This mistake is an amusing one since Hanazuki is the name of a concept store in Amsterdam that inspired an American Hasbro cartoon series that is set in a fictional cosmos populated by magical beings. Some of the symbolism is fancifully Japanese, but the cartoon deals with bigger abstract concepts. So in this sense, it is just like Prokofiev's third piano concerto. The title character, a moonflower, uses her imagination, dreams, and emotion-based powers to protect her home from being obliterated by a shapeless, pitch black void. This is the big bad I've repeatedly invoked. Quote, no one's sure where it is, or where it came from, or what it wants. The script of the first episode of the cartoon reads, the big bad obliterates everything in its wake. It's hard to stand up against it and hard to escape. Throughout his career, Prokofiev tried to use his musical powers to defend himself against the big bad. War, revolution, Stalin, censorship, illness, death. He remembered his Japanese colleagues after the big bad of the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. And he wrote to Muto Atagoro to check in on him, hoping that he was safe and that his library and the music that he had played for him was intact. Atagoro reassured Prokofiev that he was safe and that it was. Prokofiev should have stayed here. Prokofiev should have stayed in America. But frankly, his imagination failed him. He ended up being consumed by the big bad, never seeing the light on the light side again. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your great lecture, Simon. ありがとうございました。貴重な情報とモリソン先生の鋭く独創的な視点の両方を味わうことができるレクチャーでした。私を含めまして、プロコフィエフの作品への、日本へのなんか確かな影響を見出したいというような感じの思いを持ってこのレクチャーを聞いてくださった方もいらっしゃるかもしれないのですけれども、先生がレクチャーの中でおっしゃっているそもそも音楽は故郷を持たずそういう日本の旋律を見つけたいっていう思いもナショナリズム的なものだっていうことを聞いて、考えさせられたりするものでもありました。一方でまたプロコフィエフが1920年代にニューシンプリシティあるいは新古典主義の音楽語法を確立させていくきっかけが日本滞在にあったという見方も非常に斬新なものであると思いました。山田耕作との類似性もまた興味深いものでした。ではここから質疑応答に入りたいと思います。通訳が山下真由子さんにお願いしております。お願いします。フロアに村田先生、フロアに回すマイクってありましたっけ？我先に質問されたいという方はいらっしゃいますか？お願いします。そしたらお名前と はい、お名前とお願い、何をやっていらっしゃるかということをちょっと簡単に説明してから質問お願いします。
今日は素晴らしいレクチャーありがとうございました。私は、上野優子と申します。ピアニストをやっております。プロコフィエフの、ソナタ、すべてのソナタの、演奏会というものをシリーズで今やっているんですけれども、また楽譜の工程なども行っております。それで、今、プロコフィエフのソナチネのオーパス54の、2つのソナチネについての、工程を行っているところなのですが、そのうちの第1番が、ソナタ10番の断片と全く同じ箇所がありまして、で、それっていうのは、晩年に、例えばソナタの5番を、パリで書かれたものを、もう一度、ロシアでソビエトで作り直してみようと考えるとか、そういった時期と重なっているんですけれども、そのソナチネのオーパス54の、1番というものが、後にソナタの10番に出てきたっていうのはどういう影響があるふうに、先生は考えていらっしゃいますでしょうか。よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you for the question. Yes, the 10th Piano Sonata by Prokofiev was a recomposition of the sonatina. What he did in the Soviet period is he went back to a lot of the music that he composed in the Europe, and he redid it so that, for example, the symphony that he composed based on the ballet, The Prodigal Son, he turned into a massive, big, thick Soviet symphony. With regard to the sonatinas, both of them that he wanted to expand and turn into full-fledged piano sonatas. So you're very correct in actually hearing the relationship between the sonatina and the 10th sonata. The last Prokofiev, this is a fascinating detail, but before Prokofiev died, he was composing a concerto for 2 pianos in the style of Bach, and we have just some sketches for that.
プロコフィエフのソナタ10番が再度作曲されたということなんですけど、そしてそれを何が起こったかというと、ソビエト時代から、ヨーロッパに移ったとき、例えばシンフォニーとか交響曲が書かれているんですけれども、そういったようにそのオーパス54番、54のソナチネも同じように、ソナタに再作曲されているのは確実で、その影響もあるということも確実です。で、彼が、プロコフィエフが亡くなる前も、コンチェルト2大ピアノ、2つのピアノのためのコンチェルトを作曲したんですけれども、Could you repeat about the Prokofiev, the song concerto before he died?
Oh, before Prokofiev died, he was working on a concerto for 2 pianos in the musical style of Bach.
すみません。そのプロコフィエフが死亡する前に作曲していたコンチェルト、2大ピアノのコンチェルトもバッハの様式で書かれていますということなんです。
よろしいでしょうか。ありがとうございます。他にいらっしゃいますか。お願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。成城大学で国際政治を専攻しています福田と言います。今日大変興味深いお話ありがとうございます。菊間さんの補足も含めて非常に参考になりました。で、プロコフィエフが、コスモポリタンというんですかね、ノーホーム、故郷を持たないとか、もっと開かれたものを、書こうとしてたというんですかね、それは 1920年代、第一次世界大戦で戦争、これが大きなビッグバンドだったと思うんですけど、それが、その反省のもとにもっとそのナショナリズムを超えて、広くまとまろうという、それは音楽でも多分それを超えたシンプリシティっていうのは多分ちょっと共通する問題かなというふうに思うんですが、ただその作曲家とナショナルアイデンティティというのはやっぱりこう切れないところがあって、結局プロコフィエフ自身も何ていうんですかね、一種のホームシックで書いちゃうわけですよね。でそれが、つまり世界もそうで、一度は国際連盟作ったりしてインターナショナルになろうっていう話になっても、結局30年代になるとナショナリズムがまた火を吹くというような話になるんですが、そのプロコフィエフの音楽の中で、質問はここからですけど、彼が目指したその、どこのものでもないものと、だけどナショナルアイデンティティからは逃れられない、そのロシア、ナショナリズムというかどうか分かりませんけど、その彼のナショナリズムみたいなものが音楽にどういうふうにやっぱり入ってきちゃうのかっていうのは、すいません、訳しにくい質問で申し訳ないんですが、お尋ねしたい点です。
I agree. Prokofiev, during the Second World War, the big bad, was patriotic. He composed music that used folk songs. He composed the music for the film Alexander Nevsky, Ivan the Terrible. He composed various songs that folk song arrangements for patriotic reasons. So part of the reason he did this was because he sincerely believed in his country. The other reason why he did this is because he was expected to do so by the Soviet government. So he was obliged to, if not forced to.
第二次世界大戦中、いわゆる、モリソン先生がおっしゃっていたビッグパートの、中はやっぱり国家にこうパトリオティックな感じの国家に、支持する態度を取らなきゃいけなかったんですけども、そしてプロコフィエフがフォークソングとか映画とか、そういうフォークソングのアレンジとかしていって、で、ソビエト連邦からもそういうふうな効果的なものを作曲するように結構期待されていたっていうことで、プロコフィエフもそうしなければならないと感じていたです。
はい、なんかプロコフィエフがどうしても出してしまったナショナリティは何みたいな質問でしたよね。ちょっとそれもちょっともう一回お伺いしてもいいですか。なんかプロコフィエフがどうしてもこうさらけ出してしまったナショナリティみたいなのはあるんですか、音楽の中で。
You mean if there's sarcastic nationalism?
それは皮肉的なナショナリズムでしょうか。
Prokofiev lived during Stalin's time, and I don't think that he tried to be sarcastic or ironic, but his musical style was always very playful harmonically, and so a lot of the music that he Prokofiev wrote music based on Shakespeare. He wrote music based on Pushkin. He wrote music based on Dostoevsky. He wrote music based on Tolstoy. Every time he did so, he turned it into something that was his own. He had a big ego, and so he made the music and the subjects that he borrowed Prokofiev-like. And so even when he took folk songs and turned them into arrangements of folk songs, there are little features of the style that are distinctly Prokofiev's sound. And that sound can sometimes seem ironic or playful, but is very much just his natural way of composing.
プロコフィエフはスターリン政権時代に生きていたんですけども、そのプロコフィエフは特に、サーカスティックな感じになろうとはしていなくて、彼の作った音楽っていうのはとても、遊び心のある響きで、彼はシェイクスピアなんかの題材をもとに作曲しました。でフォークソングのアレンジなんかもあるんですけども、どうしてもプロコフィエフの特徴が入った音が聞き取れていて、というのもプロコフィエフはかなり大きなエゴを持っていて、どうしてもプロコフィエフの音楽の中にそれがちょっと反映していたのではないかと思います。
Let me add that with regard to the theory of Ichigo Jishi, if he borrowed that melody, there is another example of him turning something into another composer would have just quoted the melody, but he turned it into something that is his own. So bum bum ba-da-dum versus that Ichigo Jishi melody, they're quite different. There's features in common, but it becomes Prokofiev's sound. This is what he did to Russian folk tunes, is he turned them into something that was personal to him, something that was pure, так называется чистая музыка, pure music. In Russian, I said the pure music. Yeah, pure.
先ほどの質問答えにちょっと付け加えたいんですけれども、レクチャーの中であったチーコ自身、もうこれはプロコフィエフの彼自身の音楽に変化していって、でその音楽の中でも、共通した特性があるんですけれども、それをプロコフィエフの音楽に自身のスタイルで取り入れたということで、そしてそういう越後自身でもやったような方法で、ロシアのフォークソングもその様式でプロコフィエフは作曲しました。
おっしゃりたいこと分かったと思います。ありがとうございます。他にご質問ありますか？そしたら先生から言及のお名前出された沼部真一さん、布川由美子さん、あと梅津紀夫さんにお考えをお聞きしたいなと思いますが、まず、沼部さんお願いします。
沼部と申します。私と隣にいます布川さんが英語でプロコフィエフ・イン・ジャパンという論文を書いたのはもうずいぶん前で2008年なんですね。ですから、その時からあんまり私たちの考えが深まってなくて、プロコフィエフが日本でどういうことをしたのか、あるいは日本がプロコフィエフから何を受け取ったのかっていうことはずいぶん考えたんですけども、プロコフィエフが日本に滞在して日本から何かを受け取ったっていうことがあまり考えられてこなかったんですね。ですから今日のお話はとっても参考になりましたし刺激的でした。で日本人はどうしてもその越後自身問題っていうのにとらわれていて、 あんまり根拠はないと思うんですけども、その越後自身のメロディーに近いものがピアノ協奏曲の3番の修学書で聞こえる。でも実際は随分違うもんですね。全く違うと言ってもいい。それに今日のレクチャーの中にも出てきたんですけど、プロコフィエフはロシア民謡をそのまま使うっていうことは絶対にしない。でそれはもう自分は絶対にしないんだ。でそれから何かに似ているっていうふうに言われるのがとても嫌いだった。でそういう人が越後辞書をそのまま使うっていうことはやっぱり、考えられないなっていうふうに、常々思っていたんですけども、今日のお話を聞いてだいぶなんか分かってきました。やっぱりプロコフィエフはそのまま使うっていうことは絶対しない。だけど確かにそこに何か日本に2ヶ月間滞在していた時に、受けた刺激というのが、隠されているんじゃないかというふうに今日も私はレクチャーを聞いていて考えるようになりました。それが一つ。からもう一つはプロコフィエフと山田耕作がやっぱりすごく似た作曲家だっていうことです。で先生のお話にもあったんですけども2人は全く違う生い立ちでありながら同じホームランドを持っているっていうふうに先生はおっしゃったけど、全くその通りだと思いますね。ですから全く生い立ちの違う2人が1918年に同じようにニューヨークに行ってばったり会うっていうのは偶然のようでもあるし、何か必然っていうか会う宿命があったんじゃないかというふうに強く思いました。山田耕作のことをやっぱり我々はもっといろいろ考えなきゃいけない。でその山田耕作がどういう作曲家だったかということを考える上でも今日のレクチャーはとても意味があって教えられるところが大きかったと思います。どうもありがとうございます。
The one way to think about the problem of Japanese folk influence, Russian folk influence, French, German, Spanish, American, Jewish, etc. Prokofiev is not Shostakovich. Shostakovich, he quotes things, you hear the quotation. Prokofiev, he listens to the world around him, and intonations become consciously, unconsciously part of his music. He hated Asafiev because Asafiev, what he said, plagiarized French folk songs. That was not real composition. Composition is taking all of this and making it your own. With regard to this friendship with Yamada, I agree. This is a huge and wonderful relationship that needs to be explored. There are letters between Prokofiev and Yamada that are in the archives. They did so much that was similar in their careers that it deserves a book. I used to think that Prokofiev's relationship with Francis Poulenc was very close. But I think the relationship with Yamada was closer. And I think that we should all write this book together. There are letters between them. There are musical materials they shared. They met in Russia. There must be photographs, documents, articles about this in Russian that can be researched. So it's a great question.
全く同感する。森先生は全く同感しますって言っておっしゃっていて、プロコフィエフはショスタコービッチはショスタコービッチのようではなくて、プロコフィエフは、彼自身の周りにあったもの、例えば言葉のイントネーションとか、それをそのまま入れるんではなくて、プロコフィエフはそれを自然に取り入れる能力があったそうです。そして山田耕作との友人関係についてももっと、研究されるべき だと思います。そして手紙などもたくさんあるだろうし、その友人関係、山田耕作との友人関係についての本が出版されてもいいのではないかということです。
Thank you.
そうですね。はい、布川さんお願いします。
Thank you for your great lecture today. What I wanted to say about your your lecture, I wanted to say also about the Yamada. You said there are common things between them, and I thought I wanted to say, but Nubabe-san already said everything.
Okay.
So I'm sorry about that. So from today's lecture, we had a next aim. So it was a great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。そしたら梅津紀夫さんお願いします。
I'm Norio Umetsu from Kogaku University. Thank you for excellent and informative presentations. I would like to ask you two questions. One question, first one is about mobilization of Prokofiev. You say there are documents in the Russian State Archives, Lugaspi. I would like to ask you what kind of documents are there? And the second question is about nationalism. There is an idea about nationalism. Nationalism is an aspect of exoticism. How do you think about it?
Do you want to translate them into Japanese? No. What was the first question? Nationalism. Yes. With regard to documents in Ergaspi, Prokofiev had to write a request, prosba, for exemption from mobilization to the Kerensky government and then also to Lunacharsky. He had an interview in person, both with Lunacharsky and with Kerensky. Kerensky first, then Lunacharsky. And what he received was a spravka, a certificate basically saying that he was exempted from his service in the army, and also in his passport, a stamp that actually said he was svobodny hudozhnik, he could go and leave 2 times. If Prokofiev did not come to Japan in 1918, he would have been in the army. He might have been killed. Russia doesn't care. You know, if you're famous or not, you're 20 years old, you go. 27. With regard to exoticism and nationalism, this is the most complicated question in Russian musical culture. Because when in the 19th century, Russian composers decided that they needed to sound Russian, they went and did research into Russian folk melodies. They went into the country, they went to the church, and they were disappointed that the music did not sound Russian enough. And so, strangely, Russian music became something that sounds like the music of Eurasia or the Caucasus or Uzbekistan. And this is okay because Russia as a country used to be dominated by Khanates, by Mongol Tatars. that is part of their history. Russia's history is a history of early history of domination by groups of people from the East. And so they embraced these sounds from the East as their own to define a kind of exotic national sound. Yeah.
最初の質問についてなんですけれども、プロコフィエフはカレンスキーに最初に手紙を書いて、で次にナチェルスキーに手紙を書いて、その同意されること、徴兵されることの、延期してほしいということを手紙を書いて、それが受け入れられて、パスポートのスタンプが押されて、で1918年にもしプロコフィエフが日本に来ていなかったら、彼は殺害されていたかもしれないということです。そして2つ目のナショナリズムについての質問の件なんですけれども、19世紀にロシアの作曲家たちはロシア的な音楽を求めて、ロシアのフォークソングを探しに教会の中に行ったりもしたんですけれども、そこで見つけた音楽が十分にロシア的でないっていう音楽で、ユーラシア大陸とかコーカサス地方とかウズベキスタンのような音楽のような音がするものを見つけて、でそれも多分、ロシアの歴史に関わることで、ロシアは、東の人たちから支配されていたっていうことです。タタール人とかで、そういうとこから来ているんじゃないかということです。
よろしいでしょうか。ありがとうございます。ちょっと時間がだいぶ過ぎてしまっているんですけど、用事がある方は抜けていただいても良いので、Zoom の方もよろしくお願いします。あと、ピアニストの浜野さんもこのレクチャーにすごく興味を持ってくださっていたんですけれども、お聞かせ願えますか。
Professor Morrison, thank you very much for your informative lecture. There's so much new material that I have to process and to think as a performer, as an interpreter of music. I think I will follow in the steps of Umezi Sensei and ask my question in English. Actually, before the question, I have some thoughts that in some aspects are contrasting with your opinion. In your lecture, you suggested that perhaps Prokofiev should have stayed here in Japan and continue his artistic career based in East Asia. Of course, we all feel very curious to see how his style would have developed should he have stayed here in Japan. But the same can be said about if he had outlived Stalin and continued to create in the later years of the Soviet Union. Of course, it is a tragedy that he had not outlived Stalin. Looking at things realistically, my opinion is that should he have stayed in Japan, he would have resorted to dubious pleasures of playing at the clubs for expats and giving lessons to younger daughters of wealthy class in Japan. So perhaps he had not created such monumental works should he have stayed in Japan. And so the question, which is in its character a little of a smaller theme, in your lecture you mentioned that the Prokofiev style is all about vertical, to paraphrase it, all about the harmonies. But when I look, and I tend to agree with that, if looking at some pieces, for example, the 5 melodies for violin and piano, opus 35. It is so tense harmonically. But looking at other pieces for solo piano, for example, when I learned them, it is clear to see, can be clearly seen that the texture is being developed by the means of several chromatic lines progressing in contrasting directions. And just like you turn a Rubik cube, those progressions harvest new harmonies. So I would suggest here a large portion of horizontal material here. Can you name any work by Prokofiev that you can say that it consists of mostly vertical material, harmonic material?
Okay, so with respect to the first question about Prokofiev in Japan, the problem is the United States. When he went to the United States, it sucked. It was terrible. He did not have an audience. He said in his diary that he arrived in the United States too early. He had a terrible time with his first opera. He found the audiences very unimaginative and crude. So I think that Prokofiev, had he stayed here with Strzok and maybe another year, that would have been very useful. Maybe another year. But when he came here, he did not think he was going to stay at all. And he ended up being here for several weeks because of the visa and the boats. And that ended up being fascinating and an adventure. He knew nothing about Japan when he came here, except what he heard from his friend. And he was very much enriched by the experience. And then when he went to the United States, what did he find? Nothing. No, very little. No history, no culture, no audiences. A lot of incomprehension. He knew some English, so that helped him. But the audiences there just thought of him as a Bolshevik barbarian, and he found that very disappointing. With regard to the matter of Prokofiev's musical language syntax and this issue about verticality, what I mean is that this is not a composer who composed like Beethoven or German 19th century composers. He did not work with formal functional harmony. That is to say, he did not think in terms of cause and effect, tension release relationships. He worked with ostinato patterns. He worked with counterpoint. And he also worked with what I'm calling this vertical is the idea of the chromatic displacement. So that you hear C major and then you hear C sharp shadow or D flat. You hear a chord, and what he's thinking of is the various possible resolutions of that chord in many different keys, which is not the same thing as thinking about a chord going that way. Needs to resolve that way. He's thinking this chord can open up deeper and up there and just have these, and he can layer and add to the notes to the chord and enrich it as a kind of nexus or singularity. So that is basically what I was trying to get across. And to me, that singularity where there's all of these possibilities in a single sound, which is very Scriabinesque. To me, this is the biggest influence he got from Balmont's discovery of Japanese poetry. And this, I think, is actually a wonderful aspect of his music. And I will say that before Japan, no white key music. After Japan, a lot of white key music. So, and I think also that he didn't want to just compose C major melodies. Like, 5 fingers. He wanted to actually take C major and make it this beautiful cosmic radiant sound that had all of these different shadows and nuances to it. the texture. And that I think is the way in which he made the old Tchaikovsky major minor sound and sequences, he turned those into magic.
Thank you very much. I think you have convinced me that Prokofiev should have stayed longer or perhaps even come back to Japan.
最初の質問の回答なんですけど、プロコフィエフがもし、アメリカ合衆国に行ったとした、その時の問題というのは、聴衆が特にひどかったっていうことがあって、もうあと1年、プロコフィエフは日本に行ればよかったと思います。プロコフィエフが日本に来た当時は、プロコフィエフ自身は日本のことについて何も知らなかったんですけれども、アメリカに行った後、特に何も見つけることは、プロコフィエフ、彼にとって何かを見つけることはできなかったということです。そして2つ目の質問についてなんですけど、プロコフィエフは、ベートーベンとかのような19世紀の作曲家ではなくて、そのフォーマルな構成に基づいて作曲をするような作曲家ではない。例えば、半音階で動くような、どの音がどのシャープとかレのフラットになるようなさまざまな可能性のある、道を見つけて作曲したということで、なんか日本に来る前、プロコフィエフの音楽は誰もあまり好まれてなかったんですが、日本に来た後は結構人気のあるものになっていったそうです。
ありがとうございます。すごく長くなってしまっているんですけれども、先ほども申し上げましたが、用事のある方はお帰りいただいても大丈夫なんですけど、もうちょっと質問されたい方がいるみたいなので、あと最初に呼びかけるのを忘れてしまったんですけど、Zoom 参加の方で質問がある方は今日お答えする時間ないかもしれないんですけど、チャットボックスに質問を入れていただいたら後でモリソン先生にお聞きして個別にご連絡できるかもしれないので、チャットボックスにご質問を入れてください。他にありますか？そしたら実行委員会の村田先生、成城大学の村田先生から一つご質問があるということなのでお願いします。
私は成城大学の村田です。今回ですね、実行委員を務めております。で、私からのですね、モリソン先生の質問はですね、まさに今のこのウクライナ情勢に関わることなんですね。というのはね、特に今日モリソン先生に質問したいことは、プーチン大統領がですね、プロコフィエフをどのように文化政策の一環として使おうとしたのかというようなことをちょっとお聞きしたいと思うんです。というのはプロコフィエフというのはまさに今ですね、ウクライナ情勢で問題になっている、ドンバスという東ですね、ウクライナ地域のさらにその中のドネツクですね、ドネツク州とルガンスク州というのが話題になってですね、毎日のように報道されてますけども、その南の方のドネツク州のですね、ドネツクのという州とですね、その近くの、ドネツク空港というですね、空港がありまして、ここのドネツク空港が、要するにこの近くが まさに彼の成果だったんですね。ですので、このドネツク空港はですね、要するにドネツク、プロコフィエフ国際空港という形でですね、こういうのございまして、で、ここにですね、空港のこのロビーのところにもプロコフィエフの絵が描いてあります。こういうようなところでですね、まさに今の東ウクライナ問題の中心部ということがありまして、で特に2014年においてですね、ウクライナ側、ロシア側との戦闘の中でですね、2014年と申しますと、クリミアのですね、併合の時でございます。でその時にですね、この破壊されたこのプロコフィエフ空港の写真がここにございます。でさらにはここにですね、プロコフィエフの名前がもうこの崩れた形で出てたりします。で、これについて私が知ったのはですね、モリソン先生の著書の中にこのことが書いてあったんで、私も一生懸命この写真を探してですね、こういった形で今、提示してるんですね。で、実はですね、そういったことで、プロコフィエフはドネツクの生まれの人なんですけども、ただ、要するに、ウクライナ側の人ではなくて、まさに今問題になっているその東ウクライナの中のロシア側のですね、側の人なんですね、プロコフィエフが。でそれでですね、2016年にですね、プーチン大統領がプロコフィエフの125、生誕125周年ということでですね、プロコフィエフイヤーというようなことをですね、企画したということなんです。で、おそらくこれにはですね、プーチン大統領と仲のいいゲルギエフなどもですね、おそらく大きく関わったんじゃないかなと私なんか思ったりするんですけども、そういったことでですね、プーチン政権の方はプロコフィエフをそういった形ですね、まさに利用しようとしてきた面があったりする。でそういったことでですね、これはロシアの政権、プーチン政権、でそういったこういったですね、政治的な、そういう政策と申しますか、文化政策の一環としてですね、やはりこのプロコフィエフがですね、やはり利用されてきた、あるいは今でも利用されようとしているのか、そういったことをですね、ちょっとお聞きしたいということなんです。
Prokofiev was a victim of the Stalinist regime. Prokofiev was the most censored composer of the 20th century. He suffered greatly under the Soviets, but Russians argue that Prokofiev's greatest compositions were the ones that he composed in Russia. He was born in Sansovka, Krasnaya, Donetsk. The airport, international airport, imeni, named after Sergei Prokofiev, destroyed. Nothing left. Conservatory, musical conservatory named after Prokofiev, Donetsk, destroyed. The place where Tchaikovsky composed March Slav, destroyed. Putin is destroying Russia as well as Ukraine. Totalitarian regimes consume culture for their purposes. Prokofiev suffered as an artist. He did not go to a prison camp. He did not die in World War II. He was not mobilized, but as an artist, he suffered. But the Russian government, those people, Putin and company, they use Prokofiev like they use Tchaikovsky, like they use Shostakovich. Anybody who did anything good in Russia, they use for propaganda. And I don't know what to do about that. Right now in Germany, there's a performance of Prokofiev's opera War and Peace. And War and Peace was composed for Stalin. And supposedly this opera is a protest against Ukrainian invasion. It's a paradox. So I think that the use of Prokofiev as propaganda is disgusting. What we have to decide is whether or not, if you perform Prokofiev, you explain to audiences that he was a victim of the very kinds of government that are destroying Ukraine right now. I think so. Same with Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky spent a lot of his time in Ukraine. His sister lived in Ukraine. I don't think Tchaikovsky would have supported Putin's policies. Ukraine provided Russia with its religion via Constantinople. Ukraine provided Russia with its first singers, its first music teachers. So this is an atrocity.
プロコフィエフはスターリン政権の中のジレンマであって、20世紀で最も検閲の対象となった作曲家です。でもロシア人はプロコフィエフが最も偉大な作曲家の一人ということについてはちょっと意義があるようで、あるようです。そしてそのプロコフドネツクインターナショナルエアポート、その国際空港っていう名前のが、破壊されたりで、プロコフィエフの名のついた音楽学院も破壊されてしまって、でプロコフィエフは芸術家として、苦しんでいたんですけれども、プロコフィエフとかチャイコフスキー、ショスタコビチ、プロコフィエフはチャイコフスキーとかショスタコビチにされたようにプロパガンダの一部として利用されている、やっぱり利用されていると思っています。でも私たちがプロコフィエフはこういう感じっていうことを、聴衆に説明しなきゃいけないとも、思うんですけれども、ウクライナからロシアにいろんなものが入ってきているし、チャイコフスキーも、ウクライナで時間を過ごしていたということなんです。で、プロコフィエフもチャイコフスキーのように利用されていたんではないかと思います。
ありがとうございます。そしたら質疑応答はちょっとこの辺で終わりにしたいと思います。ありがとうございました。で最後にちょっと実行委員会の方から一言感想を添えさせていただきたいんですけれども、先生のレクチャーで今回花月花月っていうアニメーションがこのレクチャーの中の大きな枠組みになっていたと思うんですけれども、それが私たち実行委員会にとっては結構意義深いもので、このお手元にあるこの資料の最初のページに載っている写真なんですけど、この瀬野幸次郎とプロコフィエフと太田黒が3人で撮っている写真があるんですけれども、これに基づいて左側のプロコフィエフの単独の一人の写真があって、 で、同じ時期に撮られてるんですけど、この左側の写真は、コロンビア大学のプロコフィエフアーカイブでも、あと、ロシア語版のプロコフィエフの日記でも、日記の付属資料でもやっぱり1915年ってなってたんです。で、私はちょっとそっちの方を信じてしまって、ピーターとオカミの本出させていただいたときに、1915年の写真って書いてしまったんですけど、それ実は日本時代の1918年の写真で、それを教えてくださったのが成城大学の村田先生、お手紙くださって、そこからここの縁ができたんで、すごくしかもですね、今回いらっしゃってるその布川由美子さんが実は一番最初に気づかれて、プロコフィエフの評伝出されてるデビッド・ナイスさん、デビッド・ニース氏に教えてくださって、で、その彼のブログに載ってたりするんですけど、そういういきさつがあったので、この花月花月、しかもなんか、出回ってる情報は花月ってなってたみたいで、花月っていうものが結構裏主題となっていたのがすごく面白かったなと思っています。そのようなわけで、今後のプロコフィエフ研究においても日本側からできることっていうのがもうちょっと多いんじゃないかなっていうのが今回のイベントで分かったと思います。今回の準備のために特に梅津紀夫さん、沼部真一さんから専門的な情報を寄せていただきまして、また一つ柳文子先生や、あと日本音楽学会の東日本支部の浅山夏子さんからも大変お世話をいただいてありがとうございました。そしたら長い間お聞きくださった皆様と、あとモリソン先生と、あとピアノの浜野さん、どうもありがとうございました。それではここで閉会いたします。ありがとうございました。